For 7 years, nobody came to see Harold Bennett. Not on holidays. Not after the stroke. Not even when doctors warned his family he might not survive the night. The old man spent his final years alone in a quiet house while his children fought over an inheritance they believed already belonged to them. Then, Harold died, and suddenly everyone showed up. His son flew in the next morning. His daughter canceled a vacation to attend the will reading. Even relatives who ignored him for years filled the lawyer's office expecting a fortune. But seconds after the meeting began, the attorney placed a second envelope on the table and said, "Mr. Bennett wanted all of you to hear this together." What happened next turned the entire family against each other. One person started crying. Another stormed out. And before the meeting was over, someone called the police, because the man they abandoned for years had left behind far more than money. He left proof. Before we dive into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to like and hit that subscribe button. It means the world to us. To neighbors, Harold Bennett looked like a forgotten old widower living out his final years in silence. They saw a quiet man checking his mailbox alone every morning, eating dinner by himself every night, and sitting on the same front porch long after the streetlights came on. What nobody realized was that Harold had stopped expecting love from his family a long time ago. Instead, he started paying attention. He noticed which calls went unanswered, which birthdays were ignored, which relatives only appeared when they needed money. While his children believed the old man had become weak and confused, Harold was quietly documenting everything. Saved voicemails, unopened letters, excuses repeated so many times they sounded rehearsed. And somewhere inside that growing pile of evidence was the reason the lawyer looked nervous before opening the will. Because weeks before Harold died, something changed. Bank records shifted. Legal paperwork was updated. One family member was suddenly removed from confidential documents without explanation. Then came the phone call nobody knew about. Late one evening, Harold contacted attorney Daniel Mercer and requested a private meeting outside office hours. No family members. No witnesses. Just the old man, a sealed envelope, and instructions that could only be revealed after his death. Whatever Harold said during that meeting was serious enough that Mercer later described it as the most unusual request of his entire career. And by the time the family finally learned the truth, it was already too late to stop what Harold had set in motion. Harold Bennett built the kind of family people used to envy. Neighbors saw graduation photos covering the walls of his home, summer cookouts packed with laughter, grandchildren running through the backyard, and a man who worked himself exhausted just to keep everyone together. After returning from Vietnam in his early 20s, Harold spent decades turning a tiny repair shop into Bennett Industrial Supply, one of the most successful manufacturing businesses in the state. He missed birthdays to work overtime, slept inside his garage during difficult years, took loans against his own house to keep the company alive during recessions. Every sacrifice had one purpose: give his wife Eleanor and their children a better life than the one he grew up with. And eventually, it worked. The business exploded. The money came in. The family moved into bigger homes, drove newer cars, and lived comfortably because Harold never stopped providing. Harold built the family everyone admired. Then, he lived long enough to watch them stop caring. At first, the changes were easy to ignore. Michael stopped visiting unless he needed another loan for a failing investment. Karen became embarrassed by Harold's simple lifestyle once she started socializing with wealthier people. She once asked him not to wear his old work jacket to a country club dinner because it looked cheap. Tyler, Harold's grandson, learned quickly that a 10-minute visit usually ended with cash in his pocket. The entire family still smiled for photographs during holidays, but outside those pictures, the relationship had already started falling apart. Conversations became transactional. Calls only came when somebody wanted something. Harold noticed he was no longer invited to vacations, birthdays, or weekend dinners unless there was a financial reason attached to it. Then, Eleanor died, and whatever remained of the family disappeared with her. The house became painfully quiet. Holidays turned into excuses. Michael claimed work kept him busy. Karen blamed travel schedules. Tyler stopped answering completely unless debt collectors were involved. One Christmas Eve, Harold cooked dinner for 8 people and waited beside the front window while snow covered the driveway outside. Midnight passed. Then 1 in the morning. Nobody came. The next day, Karen uploaded vacation photos from Aspen while Michael spent the holiday gambling in Las Vegas. Harold stared at those pictures for nearly an hour before quietly setting his phone down on the kitchen table. That winter, neighbors began noticing Harold carrying around a small black notebook everywhere he went. He wrote in it constantly, after phone calls, after bank visits, after family conversations, dates, amounts, promises, excuses. The old man his children dismissed as lonely had started keeping records. And several months later, while reaching for a coffee mug inside his kitchen, Harold suddenly collapsed onto the floor from a devastating stroke. And lying there, unable to move, Harold realized something terrifying. Nobody was coming. Harold Bennett survived the stroke, but something inside him changed forever during those hours in the hospital. Doctors called Michael 3 separate times. No answer. Karen's voicemail box was full. Tyler sent a text saying he was out of town and would check in later. Nurses watched Harold lying awake in recovery, staring at the doorway every time footsteps passed his room, hoping one of his children might finally appear. Nobody came. By the second night, the hospital staff stopped asking whether family members were on their way. One nurse later admitted she had never seen a man with such a large family spend recovery completely alone. The only person who showed up was Evelyn Parker, the widow living across the street. She brought Harold clean clothes after noticing nobody else had. She picked up his medication, drove him to physical therapy appointments, and stocked his refrigerator while he struggled to walk again. Every morning before work, she checked whether his porch light had turned on. Every evening, she sat with him during dinner so he would not eat alone. Neighbors started assuming Evelyn would eventually inherit something because, unlike Harold's own family, she actually cared whether he survived. What nobody realized was that Harold had already begun reconsidering everything. 3 weeks after Harold returned home, Michael suddenly appeared at the house carrying coffee and fake concern. At first, Harold almost believed his son had finally come to apologize. Then Michael pulled paperwork from his briefcase and started talking about a new investment opportunity. He needed Harold to co-sign another business loan. The timing made Harold physically sick. While recovering from a stroke that nearly killed him, his son still saw him as a financial backup plan. Harold stared across the kitchen table and quietly asked, "You didn't come when I was dying." Michael barely reacted. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Dad, don't make this dramatic. I've been busy. Busy." Harold had spent months relearning how to walk while his son could not spare 10 minutes for a hospital visit. But the moment that finally shattered whatever hope Harold still had came several days later. Karen stopped by unexpectedly while speaking on the phone, assuming Harold was asleep upstairs. She walked into the kitchen and casually said, "Once the house sells, we'll finally be done with all this." Harold heard every word from the hallway. He stood there silently, one hand gripping the wall for support, listening to his daughter talk about his life as if he were already gone. And in that moment, Harold finally understood the truth. His family had already moved on. They were just waiting for him to die. That night, Harold made a decision. 3 months before his death, Harold Bennett quietly changed everything. Without telling his children, he contacted attorney Daniel Mercer and scheduled a private meeting after office hours. Mercer had handled Harold's legal affairs for nearly 20 years and knew exactly how complicated the Bennett family had become. Even before Harold spoke, Mercer could tell something was different. The old man arrived carrying the same black notebook he had been writing in for months, along with a sealed folder he refused to let out of his sight. According to Mercer, Harold looked exhausted, but completely certain about what he was about to do. For nearly 4 hours, the two men sat alone inside Mercer's office, reviewing financial records, property documents, and handwritten notes detailing years of ignored calls, unpaid debts, and broken promises. Harold changed beneficiaries, removed names from accounts, updated ownership records. Certain family members who believed they were guaranteed millions suddenly disappeared from confidential paperwork entirely. Then Harold made one final request that caught even Mercer off guard. He wanted private video messages recorded for every member of the family. Separate recordings. Separate envelopes. Separate instructions. Mercer later admitted it felt less like preparing a will and more like preparing a final verdict. Over the next several weeks, Harold recorded message after message inside his living room late at night. Some lasted only a few seconds. Others forced him to stop speaking because the emotion became too overwhelming. In one recording, Harold stared directly into the camera and quietly said, "I spent years begging for love from people who only loved what I could give them." In another, he addressed Michael by name and asked a question that would later leave the entire room silent. "Do you remember the last time you visited me without asking for money?" Nobody knew exactly what was inside the other recordings, including Daniel Mercer. Harold insisted the envelopes remain sealed until after his funeral. As Harold's health continued getting worse, the family suddenly became more attentive. Karen started calling more often. Michael checked in, pretending to care about recovery progress. Tyler even visited twice in the same month after hearing rumors the company might soon be sold. None of them realized Harold had already made his decision. By then, the paperwork was locked away inside Mercer's office safe, protected by instructions that could not be reversed. And when Harold Bennett finally passed away, his family walked into that lawyer's office expecting millions waiting with their names attached to it. 3 days after Harold Bennett's funeral, the entire family gathered inside Daniel Mercer's office expecting the easiest money of their lives. Michael arrived early and spent most of the wait bragging about expansion plans for a business that barely existed. Karen walked in wearing designer sunglasses and immediately asked how long the meeting would take because she had dinner reservations downtown. Tyler sat near the window scrolling through luxury car listings on his phone. Nobody talked about Harold. Nobody mentioned the hospital. Nobody spoke about the years he spent alone. The only thing filling that room was anticipation. They believed the old man had left behind millions, and every person sitting at that table expected a piece of it. Then Daniel Mercer opened the file. The confidence disappeared almost instantly. Mercer removed his glasses, looked directly at the family, and calmly announced that Harold Bennett had rewritten his entire estate plan shortly before his death. Michael laughed at first because he assumed it was some minor adjustment. Karen leaned forward, waiting to hear numbers. Tyler finally looked up from his phone. Then Mercer began reading the document aloud. Michael Bennett would receive $1. Karen Bennett would receive $1. Tyler Bennett would receive $1. Silence swallowed the room so completely that the ticking clock behind Mercer's desk suddenly sounded deafening. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody even blinked. Karen looked genuinely confused, as if she thought she had misheard him. Michael slammed both hands against the table and demanded Mercer start over. But the lawyer kept reading. The Bennett home, the company shares, Harold's savings, and nearly every remaining asset had been transferred elsewhere. A large portion of the estate went to a veterans support foundation Harold had quietly funded for years. Another amount was left to the hospital recovery unit that helped him after the stroke. Then came the name nobody in the room expected to hear: Evelyn Parker. The widow living across the street. The woman who brought Harold groceries, drove him to therapy appointments, and sat beside him while his own family disappeared. Karen immediately accused Mercer of manipulation. Tyler called the entire thing insane. Michael threatened legal action before the meeting was even finished. But Daniel Mercer simply reached for another envelope and said, "Your father left additional instructions." Then he pressed play. Harold appeared on the screen wearing the same faded work shirt he always wore inside his garage. He looked older, tired, but completely certain about every word he was about to say. "You abandoned me long before I died." Nobody spoke. Karen's eyes filled with tears almost immediately. Michael stared at the floor with his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. Tyler shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Harold continued speaking. "I kept waiting for one of you to come see me because you wanted to, not because you needed something." That day never came. The room remained silent except for Harold's voice echoing through the office speakers. Then came the line none of them were prepared to hear. "Family isn't blood. Family is who stays." The shock inside Daniel Mercer's office was only beginning. Because Harold Bennett had not spent his final months protecting money, he had spent them giving it away. After the video ended, Mercer opened one last folder containing documents nobody in the family knew existed. Quietly, Harold had paid the remaining tuition balance for his youngest granddaughter, the only member of the family who once mailed him a handwritten birthday card after everyone else forgot. He paid off Evelyn Parker's mortgage without ever telling her, ensuring the widow who helped save his life would never lose her home. He also transferred a large portion of his fortune into a veterans support fund dedicated to helping struggling former servicemen pay medical expenses and housing costs. The same man his children abandoned had spent his final days helping complete strangers rebuild their lives. Michael looked stunned. Karen could not stop crying. Tyler sat motionless, staring at the table, while Daniel Mercer continued reading Harold's final written statement. According to Mercer, Harold submitted the letter less than 2 weeks before his death after reviewing every change one final time. There was no anger in the words, no bitterness, just disappointment from a man who finally accepted the truth about the people he loved most. "I gave my family everything I had," Harold wrote. "But somewhere along the way, they stopped seeing me as a father. I became a paycheck, a backup plan, a future inheritance waiting for the right moment." Then came the final sentence. "In the end, I didn't leave behind a fortune. I left behind a lesson." Nobody in that office argued after that, because deep down, every person sitting there knew Harold Bennett was right. And maybe the hardest part of all was realizing the old man never wanted revenge. What he wanted was simple: a phone call, a visit, one honest moment proving he mattered beyond the money, but it never came. So before this story ends, ask yourself one question. If someone only shows up when money is involved, were they ever really family? After everything Harold Bennett went through, would you have forgiven your family, or walked away the same way he did? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, because stories like this force people to ask difficult questions about loyalty, respect, and what truly matters when someone grows old. And if you thought Harold Bennett's story was emotional, wait until you hear what happened to the millionaire who secretly tested his children before he died, because the results shocked everyone. Like, subscribe for more powerful real-life stories every week.